The scream
Welcome
cut
to the
through the night
Sci-Fi
like a
Writer
blade through
story.
bone
Here
sharp
you
raw,
find the best
and drenched in
Japanese story
agony
written
Thomas
by
Venn
human.
stopped mid-step, his
Listen this
breath
story.
clouding in
If
the
you
frigid
like it,
air.
subscribe
The
to
dense
channel.
forest of Era 7 loomed around him, the gnarled trees swaying in the wind like skeletal hands reaching for the sky, the planets. 3 moons hung high, casting an eerie silver glow over the twisted undergrowth. He gripped his rifle tighter, listening. The scream had been close, too close. Valeris was an ugly place, a graveyard of forgotten things. It wasn't just a lawless world. It was a discarded one, a planet rich in resources once mined to exhaustion, then left to rot when the corporation stripped it bare. Now only the desperate came here, those with nowhere else to go. People like him. Thomas had an exile on Valeris 7. For a reason he didn't want to be found. He wasn't running from the law. No, those kinds of problems were easy to outrun. He was running from himself, from the ghosts of a past that refused to stay buried. But ghost and scream, something living was out there, and it was suffering. His gut told him to walk away. He had no obligation to help. This wasn't his fight, but his feet were already moving through the dense undergrowth. He followed this sound, his boots crunching over damp leaves and broken branches. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic, blood. He slowed as he neared a break in the trees. Peering through the foliage, the ground sloped downward into a ravine, where moonlight revealed a small clearing, and there, caught in a jagged metal snare, was her, a woman not human. Her skin was deep violet, shimmering faintly under the moonlight, thick black hair cascaded in tangled waves down her back, clinging to her sweat-dampened skin. Her long feline-like legs were twisted unnaturally, and the trap's sharp teeth, blood pooling beneath her. She was starving. Thomas could see the sharp outlines of her ribs through the torn fabric of her clothing. Her breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling, and weak, uneven gasps. But even in her agony, her eyes, vivid, glowing silver, snapped up to meet his, and she snarled a warning, a challenge. Thomas didn't move. He knew that look. He had seen it before in prisoners of war, in people who had been hunted. It was the look of someone who had no reason to trust, someone who had lost everything and expected no kindness. He took a slow step forward. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't respond, didn't blink. Her body trembled violently, but she forced herself to remain upright, her claws digging into the dirt, as if daring him to try something. Thomas exhaled. She wouldn't last much longer like this. His eyes flicked to the trap, a crude, rustic contraption, meant to rather than kill, designed for intelligent prey. This wasn't random. Someone had put this here, and not for just any creature, for her, which meant someone would be coming back to check. Thomas crouched beside her, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. He pulled a knife from his belt and flicked it open. "I'm getting you out," he said evenly, "but you need to stay still." The second the blade touched the metal, she flinched. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, and for a moment he thought she might lash out. He could see the tension coiling in her muscles, the instinct to fight even if her body couldn't handle it. But after a long pause, she went still. That was all the permission he needed. Thomas worked quickly, his hands steady as he pried the rusted mechanism apart. The trap was old but still cruelly effective. One wrong move, and it could snap closed again, taking her leg clean off. The moment the pressure released, her body collapsed forward. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground. She was freezing up close. He could see the thin sheen of sweat clinging to her skin, the feverish tremble in her limbs. She was barely conscious. Her weight against him was disturbingly light. "Damn it," he muttered. For a second he hesitated. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to leave her here, walk away before whoever set the trap came looking. But then her fingers curled weakly against his chest, and something in his gut twisted. She didn't want to die. Thomas gritted his teeth. "Guess I'm making bad decisions tonight." Shifting his grip, he lifted her into his arms and carried her into the dark. The cabin was small, nothing more than a reinforced shelter tucked into the cliffs at the edge of the forest. It wasn't much, but it was hidden, secure. Thomas kicked the door open and stepped inside, moving quickly toward the cot in the corner. He lowered the woman onto the mattress, brushing damp hair away from her face. Her breathing was still shallow. She needed food, water. But first he grabbed a clean cloth and poured antiseptic over it, then carefully pressed it against the deep wounds on her leg. She flinched violently, her teeth bared in a weak hiss. "Yeah, I know," he muttered. "This is going to suck." She glared at him, even in her fevered state. He almost smirked. "So got fighting you good." He worked quickly, wrapping her leg with clean bandages, keeping the pressure firm, but not too tight. The bleeding had slowed, but she wasn't out of danger yet. Thomas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't a doctor. He could patch wounds, set broken bones. But if she didn't wake up soon, if the fever got worse, a soft sound pulled him from his thoughts. It took him a second to realize what it was, purring, faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. Al. Low rumbling vibration in her chest. Thomas frowned. Was that normal for her species? Some kind of involuntary reaction? Either way, she had stopped shivering good enough. For now, he sat back against the wall, rifle within reach, and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, he'd have questions who she was, who had left that trap for her, but for tonight, she was safe. For tonight, that was enough. Thomas woke to the sound of slow, uneven breathing. For a second, he forgot where he was. The dim glow of the cabin's small heater cast flickering shadows against the walls, the air thick with the scent of old wood, metal, and antiseptic. His muscles were stiff, his rifle still resting against his leg. His instincts had kept him half awake through the night, the way they always did when something unfamiliar lurked too close. Then he remembered her. His eyes flicked toward the cot. The Sarvana woman was still there, curled beneath the blankets, her violet skin pale beneath the glow of the emergency lamp. Her breathing was slow but steadier than before. Her fever tremors reduced to the occasion twitch. Her black hair spilled across the pillow in tangled wave strands, clinging to her damp skin. She hadn't moved much since he brought her in. That wasn't necessarily a good thing. Thomas exhaled and pushed himself upright, wincing as his joints protested. The night had been colder than expected. He had kept the heater running, but this planet had a way of sapping the warmth out of everything. Even the air felt thinner here, laced with something unnatural, something that never let man get too comfortable. He stood, stretching out the stiffness, and crossed the room. Kneeling beside the cot, he reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Warm, too warm, damn it. The fever wasn't breaking fast enough. He had given her water, tried to cool her down, but her body was still fighting a battle he wasn't sure she could win. For a moment, he just studied her. He had seen Sarvana before, once or twice in the rougher parts of the G galaxy, never up close. They were a dying race, abandoned by the same bureaucratic machine that had ruined entire systems for profit. The corporations had promised them trade, supply, stability, then pulled out when their planet's resources ran dry, leaving them to starve. Most humans didn't care. Some even hunted them, claiming they were thieves, scavengers, pests. Thomas never gave a damn about politics, but he knew what it felt like to be discarded. He had been a soldier once, a good one, the kind they sent on missions. No one wanted to talk about, the kind they abandoned when the job was done. He had seen this before. People left behind, people no one wanted. And now somehow he had one lying half dead in his bed, his lips pressed into a thin line. I should have left her, but he hadn't. And now it was his problem. A sharp inhale made him stiffen. The woman's body tensed beneath the blankets, her breathing shifting, no longer slow and labored, but quick, uneven. She was waking up. Thomas pulled back just as her silver eyes snapped open. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then she moved fast. Her arm shot forward, claws bared, aiming for his throat. Thomas was faster. His hand caught her wrist mid-strike, fingers clamping down hard. Her strength was impressive, more than he expected from someone barely clinging to life, but he'd fought stronger. He twisted her arm just enough to stop her momentum, not enough to hurt. She froze. Her chest rose and fell with sharp, panting breaths, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. Her silver eyes flicking rapidly across the room, taking in her surroundings. He saw it. Then the fear buried beneath the rage. She wasn't just attacking on instinct. She thought she was still in danger. Easy, Thomas said, voice. Even you're safe. Her breathing didn't slow. If anything, it became more erratic. Where am I? She demanded. Her voice was horror dry, like she hadn't spoken in days. My cabin. Middle of nowhere. He kept his grip firm, but not crushing you were caught in a trap. I got you out." Her gaze flicked to her leg, to the fresh bandages wrapped tight around the wounds. Her brow furrowed suspicion, wearing with confusion. "Why?" she rasped. Thomas didn't answer. Immediately he could have told her the truth, that he didn't have a good reason, that he'd spent years trying not to give a damn about anyone, but for some damn reason he hadn't been able to walk away. Instead, he just said seemed like the right thing to do. Her expression twisted into something unreadable: disbelief, distrust, anger. Then just as quickly something shifted. Her eyes darted to the door. Thomas knew that look. She was going to run. "Don't," he warned. She lunged. Despite her injuries, she moved like lightning, twisting out of his grip with surprising agility. She was fast, even weak and starving. But Thomas was ready. Before she could make it 3 steps, he grabbed her by the waist and spun her back toward the cot. She snarled, twisting in his grip, her claws flashing again. Thomas pinned her down, one knee on a mattress, his forearm bracing across her shoulders. "Enough," he snapped. She struggled, her breath hot against his skin, her body trembling beneath his hold. But it wasn't strength keeping her down, it was weakness. She had nothing left to fight with. Slowly her movements faltered, her chest heaved, her claws digging weakly into the sheets, and then finally she stilled. A long silence stretched between them. Thomas sighed. "You try to run, you last 10 minutes out there before your body gives out." She didn't respond. "You want to leave, fine, but you're not in any shape to do it yet." More silence. Then, "Let me go." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. He released her wrist, easing back, but not moving far. "Do you want to get out of here? Eat something first, get your strength back." She stayed tense beneath him, but something in her posture shifted. She knew he was right. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head, those piercing silver eyes locking onto his. "I don't trust you." Thomas smirked. "Good, I don't trust you either." A beat of silence. Then, against all odds, she let out a weak, bitter laugh. Thomas released her, fully stepping back. She didn't lunge again, didn't fight, just lay there watching him. A fragile, unspoken truths. For now, that was enough. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose panels on the cabin's roof, the old structure groaned, shifting under the weight of a storm. Outside, inside, the heater hummed faintly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. The scent of damp earth, old metal, and the faint burn of antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Thomas sat at the edge of the wooden table, his fingers drumming lightly against the surface, eyes locked onto the woman on the cot. Talia. She sat stiffly, her back pressed against the wall, as if expecting an attack at any moment. Her silver eyes flicked toward the door. Every few minutes, her mind already measuring the distance, calculating how fast she could get there. The blanket draped over her shoulders. It slipped slightly, revealing the smooth, violet skin of her arms, marred with faint, almost deliberate scars. Not fresh wounds, old ones she had seen battle before, felt pain before. Thomas let out a slow breath. Everything about her set off warning bells in his head. She was supposed to be weak, barely alive. Yet he could see the way she held herself. Her posture wasn't one of exhaustion, it was one of control. She wasn't broken, she was just waiting. He leaned back, arms crossed. "You going to tell me your name? Or do I have to keep calling you the woman I dragged out of a trap?" Talia didn't answer. Not surprising. She hadn't spoken much since waking. Aside from the few clicked, irritated words she'd thrown at him earlier, the distrust in her expression hadn't faded. If anything, it had sharpened. Thomas sighed and stood, walking over to a small shelf near the heater. He grabbed a canister, popped the lid, and scooped a chunk of dense protein paste into a metal bowl before placing it on the table between them. "You need to eat," he said. Talia didn't move. Her eyes flicked to the food, then to him, suspicion darkening her gaze. He exhaled. "I don't know how many times I have to say this, but if I wanted you dead, you wouldn't be sitting there still." She hesitated, her fingers curled around the blanket, knuckles pressing against the rough fabric. Then slowly she reached for the bowl. Instead of eating, she lifted it closer and sniffed, a deliberate, controlled motion, checking for poison. Thomas said nothing. He just watched. It made sense. The Serani were hunted. If she had been on the run long enough, she'd have learned that food wasn't always a gift, it could be a death sentence. After a moment, she took a cautious bite. She didn't grimace, didn't react at all. Really just chewed, swallowed, then took another. Thomas smirked. "Taste like." Talia didn't answer, but the brief flicker of something in her expression, annoyance, maybe told him enough. He leaned back Against the table better than starving. A long silence stretched between them. She kept eating slowly, cautiously. He let her when the bowl was nearly empty. He finally spoke again. You got a plan after this? His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Somewhere to go. Talia didn't look up. I'll manage. He raised an eyebrow. On one good leg in the middle of nowhere. He gestured toward the window where the storm outside raged through the trees. You wouldn't last a day. Her grip on the bowl tightened. I'll take my chances. Thomas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Stubborn, not surprising. But he wasn't about to let her limp out of here just to die in a ditch somewhere. Look, I don't care what your story is, he said finally. You don't have to tell me anything, but you need to be realistic. Right now, you're in no shape to be running anywhere. You need rest, food, and time. She still didn't look at him, but her jaw tightened. A long pause stretched between them before she finally spoke again. Talia, her voice was quiet, measured. Thomas tilted his head slightly. That your name? She hesitated just for a second, then gave a small nod. He rolled the name around in his head. Talia. It suited her all right, he said simply. Her silver eyes flicked up, almost suspicious, like she'd expected a different reaction. Thomas didn't push. Instead, he stood, grabbed his coat from the hook near the door, and slung it over his shoulders. I need to check the perimeter, he said, pulling on his gloves. Stay put, rest. She said nothing. He stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and biting against his skin. The wind had died down, but the forest had taken on an eerie stillness. Something was wrong. Thomas moved carefully, keeping to the shadows. As he made his way toward the ravine where he had found her, the ground was still disturbed. The broken foliage marking his path from earlier, the trap, was still there, rusted metal glinting faintly under the moonlight. But then he saw it, boot prints, fresh ones. His stomach tightened. Someone had been here after him. He crouched low, running his fingers over the imprints in the dirt. 3, maybe 4 men. They had come from the south, checked the trap, and then followed his trail back toward the cabin. Thomas clenched his jaw. They knew someone had taken the Sarvana woman, and they were looking for her. His mind worked quickly. If they were just scavengers, they'd come in loud. If they were slavers or worse, hunters, they come quiet. And that meant he didn't have much time. He turned sharply, heading back toward the cabin. With quick, controlled steps, his hand hovered near his rifle. Every nerve in his body primed for a fight. By the time he pushed through the door, Talia was already awake, her silver eyes locked onto him. She had felt it too, what she asked, voice sharp. Thomas didn't answer right away. He grabbed his second rifle from the weapon rack and checked the charge. We've got company, he said finally. She stiffened. How many? 3, maybe more, he said, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. Track them near the ravine. They know you're alive. They're looking. Her fingers tightened into fists. They hunters, she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas studied her, watching the way her breath slowed, the flicker of something dangerous beneath her exhaustion. You know them, he asked. A slow, bitter smile coasted across her lips. They're the ones who put me in that trap. The words settled heavy in the air between them. Thomas exhaled, rubbing his temple. Fantastic. He moved toward the window, peering outside. We need to move. Before he could take another step, he heard the faintest shift of movement. He turned and froze. Talia was standing. She was still, weak, still unsteady, but she was standing. She met his gaze, her silver eyes gleaming faintly. If we run, she said quietly, they'll keep hunting us. Thomas considered that for a long moment. Then slowly he asked, so what do you suggest? Talia picked up the knife from the table and twirled it once between her fingers. We killed him first, for the first time in a long while. Thomas felt the hint of a grin tug at the corner of his mouth. Maybe she wasn't so different from him after all. The night had turned against them. Thomas could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that settled deep in his bones, a warning honed from years of knowing when a fight was coming. The forest outside was eerily still, the usual sounds of distant wildlife replaced by something far more unsettling, silence. Someone was out there, and they were hunting. He kept his stance loose, but ready, watching Talia from the corner of his eye. She was standing now, despite the pain, her posture tense, but balanced. She gripped the knife with steady fingers, rolling it once between her knuckles before tightening her hold. The firelight flickered across her violet skin, casting sharp shadows along Her cheekbones, she had recovered too fast. A normal person, a normal human, wouldn't have been able to stand, let alone prepare for a fight after the kind of damage he had taken. But Talia wasn't human, and Thomas was starting to think that was exactly why they wanted her. He checked the charge on his rifle, sliding a fresh power cell into place. With a soft click, "You sure about this?" he asked. Voice low. Toya met his gaze, her silver eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Running won't stop them," she said simply. "We end it now, or we spend the rest of our lives." Looking over our shoulders, Thomas exhaled, slowly rolling his shoulders. She wasn't wrong. He had seen enough hunts in his time to know how this worked. If they let these men live live, they'd just keep coming. More would follow. The chase wouldn't end until one side was buried in the dirt. And Thomas had no plans of dying tonight. He moved to the window, peering out into the blackness between the trees. The ground sloped downward beyond the cabin, giving him just enough visibility to spot shadows moving in the distance. For men, maybe more. They were keeping their distance for now, but they weren't leaving, waiting, trying to box them in. His jaw tight. These weren't just desperate mercenaries looking for a quick payout. They were trained. Thomas turned back toward Talia, watching the way her jaw clenched, the way her breath came slow and measured. He had spent enough time reading people to know when someone was hiding something. "You know why they want you," he said evenly. It wasn't a question. Talia stilled. A beat of silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then she looked away. "It doesn't matter, does if it's only to get me killed?" Thomas shot back. Her fingers curled tighter around the knife. "I didn't ask you to save me, no. But I did, and now they're here, so tell me, what the hell did you do?" Tal's throat bobbed slightly, her expression unreadable. She turned away, running a hand through her tangled hair before exhaling sharply. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, rougher. "It's not what I did," she muttered. "It's what I am." Thomas frowned. "That's not an answer." She hesitated, then pulled back the torn fabric at the side of her shirt, revealing more of her skin. But it wasn't just skin. A mark was there, faint but unmistakable, etched just below her collarbone. Not a tattoo, not a scar, a brand. Thomas narrowed his eyes. The shape was unfamiliar, but the meaning was clear. It was a claim, a symbol of ownership. His stomach turned. "You were a prisoner." Talia let out a short, bitter laugh. "A test subject." His blood ran cold. Thomas had heard whispers before, rumors passed in the darker corners of the galaxy. Illegal experiments, genetic modifications, entire species being stripped down and rebuilt like machines. But wasn't just stories, was it? "Oh," he asked, vow like steel. Talia let the fabric drop back over her shoulder, fixing him with a hard look. "You already know," she said, and he did. Black Hollow, the name sat like a weight in his chest. He had crossed paths with them before, once years ago, on a mission. He was never supposed to come back from. Black Hollow wasn't just another mercenary outfit. They were off-the-record military contractors operating in the shadows, taking contracts no government wanted to admit existed. They specialized in the kind of work that never made it into official reports: assassination, smuggling, human and non-human experimentation. And now they were here, hunting her. Thomas exhaled through his nose. "What do they do to you?" T's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away this time. "They try to make me stronger," she said, voice edged with something sharp. "Tried to turn my species into weapons. I was one of the last survivors." His fingers clenched around his rifle. "Weapons, of course." That explained why she was healing so fast, why she moved the way she did. It wasn't just her natural abilities. They had changed her. Before he could say anything else, a faint rustle in the distance snapped his focus back to the present movement. Thomas shifted, pulling his rifle into position. "They're moving in." Talia nodded, adjusting her grip on her knife. "For that I can see," Thomas continued. "More might be waiting." Talia exhaled. "Then we don't give them the chance to regroup." She was right. They had to move first. Thomas ran through the plan in his head. The cabin was useless, too open, too vulnerable. If the hunters had explosives or even just patience, they could pin them inside and wait. They had to get outside into the forest, where they could control the fight. Thomas glanced at her. "You sure you're up for it?" This Talia gave him a sharp look. "Are you?" He smirked, his spite himself. "Then let's move." They slipped out the back, stepping into the night. The cold hit first, biting through his coat, but Thomas ignored it. The forest stretched out before them, endless shadows, swallowing every trace of movement. A single breath passed, then gunfire, a pulse round tore through the trees, splintering bark inches from Tal's head. She dropped low, rolling into the undergrowth, her knife flashing under the moonlight. Thomas fired back, catching one of the hunters in the chest. Before he could adjust his aim, the man dropped without a sound. Another one moved from the right too close. Talia was already on him. She moved faster than she should, have her injured leg barely slowing her as she slid past his guard and drove the blade deep under his ribs. A strangled gasp, then silence. Thomas caught the last one just before he could retreat. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The forest fell silent again. Thomas exhaled, scanning the tree. No more movement. Not yet. Talia wiped her blade against the fallen man's jacket. Breath steady. They'll send more, she murmured. Yeah, Thomas agreed. And the next wave wouldn't be just scouts. Black Hollow knew where they were now, and they weren't going to stop until they had her. Thomas clenched his jaw. You should have left her in that trap. But now there was no turning back. The bodies were already cooling in the dirt. Thomas exhaled, lowering his rifle, scanning the tree for any sign of movement. The distant wind howled through the branches, but aside from the fresh corpses sprawled across the forest floor, there was nothing. No more gunfire. No footsteps, no voices for now. It was quiet, too quiet. He knew better than to trust it. Talia was crouched beside one of the bodies, her knife glinting under the faint moonlight as she wiped the blade clean against the man's jacket. Her breathing was steady, her posture loose, but ready. Even after the fight, the way she moved, the way she had killed without hesitation. Thomas knew that kind of experience. She had done this before, maybe not just for survival. Check them for anything useful, he muttered, moving toward the man he had shot. Ammo, see devices, anything that tells us what we're dealing with. Talia didn't argue. She was already rifling through the first man's pockets, her expression unreadable. Thomas crouched beside the leader, the one she had taken down first. Even in death, his face was hard, eyes frozen open in shock. Not a common mercenary. These guys weren't just grunts looking for a quick payout. He unzipped the man's vest, searching for ID, a signal beacon, anything. His fingers brushed against a metal plate inside the lining, pulling it free. He turned it over in his palm, a black hollow insignia. Talia glanced up from her search, her silver eyes narrowing. What is it? Thomas flipped the plate over, showing her the barcode burned into the back. Her face darkened. They were tagged, she muttered, which means someone was tracking them. Thomas said grimly he had seen this before. Military-grade personnel tracking. These weren't independent contractors. These men weren't just mix hire to find her. They were owned. Talia exhaled sharply, standing. If they were tagged, their signals just went dark. Thomas nodded, and whoever's running this operation just realized they'd lost a team. Silence hung between them. That meant reinforcements were coming. Thomas stood, slipping the insignia into his pocket. We need to move now. Talia didn't argue. She yanked a spare pistol from one of the fallen men's holsters and checked the charge. It was standard black hollow issue, compact, reliable. She tucked it into her belt before grabbing a small round device from another body and tossing it to Thomas, a communicator. He caught it, flipping it open, half expected static. Instead, a voice crackled through the small speaker. Delta Team report. Thomas's eyes met Talis. The voice repeated, this time sharper. Delta Team reporting. Talia moved fast, stepping over the bodies, retrieving another communicator from a second quartz. She pulled out a small sharp tool from her belt and pried the casing open, exposing the inner wiring. Thomas didn't have to ask what she was doing. She was scrambling their signal. Her fingers worked quickly, severing a few wires, redirecting the frequency. The voice on the other end of the cal grew, distorted, fading in and out before cutting off entirely a few seconds later. A different voice replaced it, static, then relay compromised, sending recon unit. Thomas swore under his breath. T's jaw tightened. That means they're close. How close? She exhaled. If they had a secondary team nearby. Less than an hour. Less than an hour before more of them arrived. They had no choice now. We need a way off this planet, Thomas muttered. Standing fast, Talia shook her head. No ship is going to take me. Then we find one we can steal. She studied him for a second before nodding. There's a black hollow landing site about 15 kilometers west. They keep short-range transport ships there. Thomas's brows furrowed. How do you know that? Hesitated, then said, because it's where I escaped from his stomach. Twisted, he didn't press not now, but that meant Black Hollow had a full base here. A controlled sector, and if they were keeping ships there, it wasn't just a scouting team, this was a long-term operation, which meant she wasn't the only target. Thomas exhaled sharply. Then that's where we're going. Talia didn't argue. She turned, slinging the stolen rifle over her shoulder, adjusting the strap as if it belonged there. She moved like a soldier, like someone who had fought in too many battles, but had never worn a uniform. Thomas wasn't sure if that made him trust her more or less, but right now it didn't matter. They had less than an hour to disappear, and if they failed, they wouldn't get a second chance. Flashback: 3 months ago, Talia couldn't breathe. Her body ached every nerve, screaming as she was forced on her knees, metal restraints digging into her wrists. This sterile white walls of the Black Hollow facility pulsed under flickering lights, the scent of burned ozone and antiseptics filling her lungs. A man stood in front of her, his gloved fingers tracing along a datapad, eyes scanning information she couldn't see. "You're the last one left," he said, voice smooth, clinical. "That makes you valuable." Talia swallowed, the bee rising in her throat. She had seen the others, the ones who had been taken before her. None of them had survived the procedures, the enhancements. She was never supposed to survive either. But she had the man crouched in front of her, tilting his head. "We put millions into your kind. Do you understand that?" She said nothing, his lips pressed into a thin smile. "You're not Sarvani anymore." "Not really." Her jaw clenched, his eyes flicked toward her wrists, where faint, glowing lines pulsed beneath her skin, the result of their work. "Fascinating," he murmured. She lunged, or tried to. The restraints sent a pulse of electricity through her body, locking every muscle in place. She gasped, gritting her teeth against the pain as the man simply sighed. "You're not ready yet," he said, "but you will be." Talia forced herself to meet his gaze, silver eyes burning with hatred. He smiled then. Everything went black. Present day, back to the forest. Talia pushed forward through the underbrush, ignoring the throbbing ache in her leg. Black Hollow would be coming. She knew how they worked, relentless, methodical, precise. They didn't lose assets, and she was still an asset to them. Not anymore. She would die before going back. She glanced at Thomas, who was moving beside her, keeping pace. He hadn't asked any more questions, not yet. He knew he had them. But for now, he was helping her, and that meant for the first time in a long time she wasn't alone. She wasn't sure if that made her feel safer or more afraid, but either way they had to move, because Black Hollow was coming, and she refused to be caught again. The forest stretched endlessly before them, its towering trees shrouded in mist. The night was deep, the cold biting, but neither Thomas nor Talia slowed their pace. They moved through the undergrowth like ghosts, weaving between the shadows, leaving no trail behind. The Black Hollow landing site was still 10 kilometers west, too far to cover before sunrise, but close enough that they had no choice but to keep moving. Talia barely felt the ground beneath her feet. Adrenaline dulled the pain in her leg, pushing her forward despite the dull throb echoing in her bones. She should have collapsed by now. A wound like hers should have kept her crawling, if not dead, but she wasn't normal anymore. Her body was healing faster than it should have, the ache fading with every breath, a side effect of the experiments. The same ones that had left scars beneath her skin. Changes she still didn't fully understand. She had spent so long hating what they had done to her. Tonight, she would use it to kill them. Beside her, Thomas moved with practiced efficiency, scanning the terrain, his rifle always at the ready. His face was unreadable, but she could feel the weight of his thoughts. He knew she was different now. She had seen the realization settle in his eyes back at the cabin, in the way his jaw had tightened when she stood too soon, when she moved too easily. He hadn't said anything, not yet. A part of her wondered how much longer his silence would last. She didn't have to wonder for long. Back of the cabin, he said, voice quiet but firm, "You should have been half dead. Instead, you're walking, fighting, healing." Talia didn't answer. Thomas glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "What do they do to you?" She exhaled through her nose. "You already know." "Yeah," he admitted, "but I want to hear you say it." Her grip on the stolen pistol tightened. Black Hollow wanted more than soldiers, she said finally. "They wanted weapons, living ones. They spent years trying to make it work, testing on my kind, forcing us to." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Only a handful of us survived the process, And by then we weren't even Sarvani anymore. More Thomas was silent for a moment, taking in her words. Then he asked, "What can you do?" Talia let out a humorless laugh. "They never told us, never explained, just tested over and over." She flexed her fingers, staring at her palm. "My heel. Faster, move faster. My body burns hotter than it should. And sometimes when I fight." She hesitated. Thomas raised a brow, which she exhaled, turning to meet his gaze. "I don't feel like myself anymore." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he simply said, "You're still you." Talia wasn't sure if that was true, but she didn't argue. They kept moving. They reached the outskirts of the Black Hollow landing site just before dawn. It wasn't just a simple outpost, a fortified compound stretched before them, surrounded by reinforced barriers, guard towers, and automated turrets. In the center of the base, 3 Black Hollow ships sat on a landing pad, engines cold, waiting for departure. Armed soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp and methodical. This wasn't just a hunting party, this was a fully operational facility. Thomas swore under his breath. "They've been here longer than I thought." Talia has scanned the area, her stomach twisting. "They weren't just here for me." Thomas nodded, "Which means they won't leave empty-handed." They crouched behind a ridge, watching the bays from the cover of the trees. The ships were their way off this planet, but getting to them wouldn't be easy. Talia's eyes flicked toward the main control tower. "That's where they monitor comms. If we can disable it, they won't be able to call for reinforcements." Thomas followed her gaze. "And if we take out the power supply, those turrets go down." Talia smirked. "I like the way you think." He glanced at her. "You sure you're up for this?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Are you?" A hint of a grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. They moved fast, keeping low, using the terrain to their advantage. Talia broke off, first moving toward the power station, while Thomas circled around toward the tower. The plan was simple: knock out their systems, then steal a ship before anyone could stop them. But Black Hollow was waiting. Talia reached the power station without being seen. She pressed her back against the cold metal, listening. 2 guards patrolled outside, their weapons held loose, unaware of what was coming. She moved like a shadow, 1 step, then another. The first guard barely had time to register her presence before she snapped his neck with a single twist. The second turned, his hand flying to his weapon. She lunged, driving her knife into his throat. Before he could shout, he dropped. Talia wiped her blade clean and moved inside. The generator hummed softly in the center of the room, cables snaking along the floor. She scanned the control paint panel, searching for manual override. She found it. A few quick adjustments, and the system overloaded. The lights flickered, then darkness. The base shuddered as the defenses collapsed. She didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran. Thomas had just reached the control tower when the power cut. The moment the lights died, alarm screamed to life. He moved fast, cutting through the confusion, dropping guards before they could react. He reached the comms terminal and smashed the controls, severing their connection to the outside. No reinforcements, no backup. Now it was just a fight. He sprinted back toward the landing pad, his rifle snapping up as a Black Hollow soldier rounded the corner. 1 shot, 1 kill. Then he saw her. Talia was already there, cutting through the last of the guards, her movements too fast, too precise. He had seen trained killers before, but this was something else. She fought like a force of nature, her body moving before the enemy could react. Her strikes brutal and efficient. He knew what she was now, what they had made her into, but she wasn't theirs anymore. "Thomas!" she shouted. He didn't hesitate. They sprinted toward the closest ship, dodging gunfire, moving in sync. Thomas hit the controls, forcing the hatch open. They scrambled inside as bullets ricocheted off the hull. "Talia, get us in the air!" he barked. She didn't argue. The engines roared to life, the ship shuddering as it lifted from the ground. Soldiers scattered below, shouting, firing. But it was too late. They were gone. The ship broke through the atmosphere, leaving Valeris behind. For the first time in a long time, Talia felt something strange, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Freedom. She sat back in the co-pilot's seat, breathing hard, staring at the stars stretching before for them. Thomas exhaled beside her, rubbing a hand over his face. "That was insane." Tal smirked. "I've had worse." He shook his head, but there was something like amusement in his expression. The stars stretched endlessly before them, a sea of light against the vast emptiness of space. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, a steady rhythmic sound that felt almost comforting after the chaos. They had left behind. Thomas sat in the pilot's seat, one hand on the controls, the other resting against his knee. He was tired, exhausted, really, but his mind wouldn't let him rest just yet. His thoughts ran in loops, playing back every moment of the past few days. Valera 7. The hunters, the escape, and Talia. She sat beside him, her violet skin illuminated by the dim light of the cockpit, her silver eyes fixed on the view beyond the glass. She hadn't spoken much since they left the planet. He wasn't sure if she was thinking, processing, or just trying to figure out what the hell came next. He couldn't blame her. For the first time in years she was free, and for the first time in his life Thomas wasn't entirely sure what he was supposed to do. "You're staring," Talia murmured, her voice softer than usual. Thomas huffed, turning back to the controls. "No, I'm thinking about what." He hesitated, then glanced at her. "About what happens now?" She let out a slow breath, leaning back against the seat. "That makes two of us." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I'd never really had a next. It was always just escape." Her fingers traced over the edge of the console absently. "I don't know what to do with freedom." Thomas studied her, taking in the way her shoulders had finally lost their tension, the way her breathing had evened out. She still had the edge of a fighter, but there was something else now, something softer. "You don't have to figure out tonight," he said finally. Talia smirked. "No, thought you liked having a plan." "I do." He shifted slightly, turning to face her more fully. "But I think we've earned a night off." She raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do we do on a night off?" Thomas gave her a slow, knowing look. "That depends." T's smirk faded, her expression shifting into something unreadable, something intense. The air between them changed. They had fought together, pulled together, survived together. There had been no time to process anything beyond staying alive. But now they had time. And there was something undeniable between them. Talia shifted in her seat, watching him carefully. "You ever get tired of running?" Thomas exhaled. "Every damn day." Her gaze dropped, his mouth just for a second. He noticed, and he didn't look away. Slowly, carefully, Talia leaned closer, her movements deliberate but hesitant, as if she was still trying to decide if this was a mistake. Thomas made the decision for her. He reached up, brushing his fingers against her jaw, tilting her face just enough to close the last of the space between them. Their lips met. The kiss was slow, deep, not rushed, not desperate. It wasn't about survival or adrenaline or escape. It was about this, about them. Talia exhaled against his mouth, her hand gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. Thomas let himself sink into the warmth of her, his free hand sliding up her back, feeling the tension in her muscles slowly melt away. For the first time since they met, neither of them was fighting, neither of them was running. It was just them. When they finally broke apart, Talia didn't move far. Her forehead rested lightly against his, her breath warm against his skin. Thomas smirked. "So this is what freedom looks like." Talia let out a quiet laugh. "It's a start." The moment stretched between them, comfortable, certain. Then with a small sigh she pulled back slightly, tilting her head. "So what's the next plan?" Thomas grinned. "I thought we weren't planning tonight." "Maybe," she murmured, her fingers still curled against his chest. "But tomorrow." Thomas leaned in, brushing another soft kiss against her lips before murmuring, "Tomorrow we figure it out together." And for the first time in years that idea didn't scare him. It felt like a beginning, the end.